Hi, welcome to Free Exchange. I'm Howard Wall, the director of the Hammond Institute and of the Center for Economics and the Environment here at Lindenwood University. In today's episode, we're going to be talking to Rachel Douchant, who is the director of the Liberty and Ethics Center and also a philosopher here at Lindenwood. Now, Rachel, everyone knows that libertarians are obsessed with pot smoking.
Yes,
and that's
right.
all they care about is pot smoking. So libertarianism is all about smoking pot.
That's right.
But you seem to, have some differing view on that at
No,
times.
I do.
You say, no, there's more to it than that. So here's your opportunity for our millions of
Set the
viewers
record straight.
to set the record straight and to tell us what libertarian means to you.
Okay, sure. Well, I have had a colleague actually say to me, "Aren't you pro-drugs?" I said, no, I'm anti the drug war, right? There's a big difference. He goes, oh, okay. So, yeah, that is kind of a stereotype of libertarians, and I'm sure they're out there, the ones who are primarily concerned about that. But no, I think that actually libertarians are often called, the party of principle. And so when we think about what the principles are, there's a great concern for individual rights and the rights and for freedom in terms not just of social freedom, but also economic freedom. And so libertarians see the left and the right in America as being inconsistent on the question of freedom. One wants to give you social freedoms but not economic freedoms, and the other wants to give you economic freedoms but not social freedoms. So the libertarian is saying, hey, why don't we just be free? Totally. And so a big investment in individual rights. Libertarians tend to be very excited about what the free market can do, what people can do through market exchange, but also in civil society, what they can do through voluntary organization. And there's a thoroughgoing skepticism of the state apparatus, and of any bureaucracy which is based on coercion. And so some libertarians, for instance, will appeal to the harm principle, which comes from John Stuart Mill, so that the principle is that I can only harm you if you're harming someone, either me or someone else. And if you're not, then I really have no right to interfere with you.
All right, so now you're claiming that it's not just about the pot, but there might be some centuries-old
pot is just one of the many things.
philosophical
it's true.
Thinking that backs this up.
Yeah.
So let's step back a couple of centuries, or maybe.
Oh, let's go all the way back. No,
please, let's just make it a couple centuries.
I guess, we tend to associate libertarian thinking with classical liberalism, which we see in the modern philosophical period with people like John Locke, David Hume, Immanuel Kant is a classical liberal as well, and John Stuart Mill.
I understand he was a real pissant.
That's according to the Monty Python song, yes.
Sorry.
The Philosopher's Drinking Song, a great one. So we tend to associate it with that, but actually when we look at the great, our great heroes, the founders, right? The founders of our nation, what we actually see them referring to is really the Roman Republic in some cases, and looking at the whole natural law tradition, which starts very early. I mean, even Cicero can be seen as an early natural law thinker, and then coming up through Thomas Aquinas. And many of our founders, for instance, didn't even have John Locke on their bookshelves. They had William Blackstone, the great natural law legal theorist, on their bookshelves. So sometimes the libertarian movement, as we see it today, is a little lopsided, I think, in terms of the actual tradition of classical liberalism. They tend to focus heavily on a Lockean idea of property rights, but there's really a much richer tradition to be drawn upon. And when you meet actual libertarians, they're quite varied. So it depends on who's sort of representing. The Libertarian Party doesn't necessarily represent actual libertarian people.
Well, so that's interesting. So what part of it are they maybe missing out on? Because I think you're right. It is, if you think of the Libertarian Party today, property rights seems paramount. But you say there's something else.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, if you look at the Republican tradition, and I'm talking about little r Republican, not capital R Republican, Republicanism is about living in a society in which people can look each other in the eye. There's no sense that I have to look down. I don't have to scrape in front of anyone. So even if I have less money than you or I'm unequal in some other way, there's a sense of equal citizenship and equality before the law. And that's heavily valued. And so you see in the Roman Republic, even people who were considered disgusting criminals like St. Paul, if he raises his hand and says, oh, by the way, did you know I'm a Roman citizen? Everybody jumps back. They're not about to keep on beating him. They say, oh, what do you want? Well, I want to go before the emperor. Okay, let's go. So it's the rule of law, the importance of the rule of law, and that officers of the law are making decisions based on that structural system, not based on the whim of the magistrate or something like that. So that's an important element. And you also have a heavy, heavy emphasis on virtue coming up through the natural law tradition, in which, there's, and you see this in many wonderful libertarian organizations like the Acton Institute, where they have their summer institute on virtue and responsibility. And the notion that, and you see this in Jefferson, many of our founders, the notion that you can't have a free society in which people are vicious morally. A free society depends upon a civil society that encourages personal virtue. So sometimes you'll hear libertarians talk like, any accountability to anyone is a violation of my individual rights. So if I say, well, I'm going to go ask my priest about that, they'll say, well, that's not very libertarian of you. What? That doesn't make any sense at all. The fact that I have a community I'm accountable to is why I don't need the state to come in and interfere with my moral life.
Well, one of my favorite jokes from The Onion, which is a satirical newspaper,
real newspaper,
it's tough to tell sometimes, was a headline, Libertarian calls fire department and has mixed feelings.
That's right.
So what's
using the public good there?
Yes.
Yeah. So public goods problems and externalities problems are certainly real. I have a mixed view of this myself. I think that on the one hand, anarcho-capitalists, these are very extreme individual rights libertarians who think that we can do without the state altogether. I think they're interesting, actually. I'm not one myself, but I think they're interesting because they're constantly running thought experiments about how we could run things privately that are currently being done publicly. And the fact is that if something is currently being done publicly, or maybe even had to have been done publicly at one time, it doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't in the future be done privately. I mean, for instance, roads. We think of roads. Well, modern corporations, or current contemporary corporations, have GDPs bigger than small countries. Could they create roads? Probably. Could they charge for it with some little electronic ding as your car passes by? Probably, right? And so the idea that that could happen in the future and that those things don't need to necessarily stay statically as public goods, I think is interesting. But certainly the provision of public goods, if they're truly public goods, I'm not objecting to. And particularly if they're provided at the local or state level. And I think this is something where, we see libertarians needing to invest more in the historical tradition. Because if you look at our tradition of federalism, that's not a straightforward tradition of individual rights. That's individual rights, group rights, the rights of the local region, and so forth. And so it's much more interesting than just a totally programmatic kind of story of individual rights. So I think my complaint against that kind of libertarian account is it's a little too Enlightenment. It's a little too perfect. They've got a systemic kind of first principle of individual property rights, and they try to solve every problem. I mean, I've heard people try to solve the abortion problem based on the property rights of the fetus versus the property rights of the mother. Boy, that just is odd. It's a really odd way to approach a problem like that.
Well, so you think there's any time that the United States, you were talking about at its founders, was anything like a libertarian country, or how libertarian was the U.S. set up to be? Because often libertarians will harken back to, conservatives also, so it's different, harken back to the original rules of the country. Certainly on the economic side, there was a lot less intervention. But what about individual rights? Right.
I mean, it depends on how broad you want to make your definition of libertarian be. And so I want to include the Federalist tradition in that. But what that means is that you're going to have states, for instance, that had state churches. The federal government didn't have one because that was in the Bill of Rights, but that wasn't necessarily adopted into the Bill of Rights of the states. And so you have eventually states going ahead and dropping them, probably just because they're becoming pluralistic. So that just happens naturally, but we're not necessarily objecting to that. And so you will hear libertarians sometimes say that in a truly libertarian society, you may have small societies that are quite totalitarian, maybe not totalitarian, but authoritarian, like an Amish society, for instance, where your way of life is dictated quite strictly. And the main concern of libertarians is simply that you have the right to exit. That's really the big deal there. You're free because you've chosen a certain way of life that simply requires a stronger social structure. There's nothing non-libertarian about that as long as you can leave. Now, of course, people make interesting objections about sort of psychological slavery, right? How it's so hard to leave and things like that. But I think that's kind of a fact of human life. I mean, that can be true in a dysfunctional family just as easily as it can be true in an Amish society, you know? So I don't know that we can really escape that.
Right. Now, certainly these days, libertarians are, well, the Libertarian Party seems to have more prominence. They don't win elections, but they're maybe out there more.
That is true, and even the term libertarian, I don't know that people were particularly familiar with it maybe 20 years ago. I mean, you would know better than I, Howard.
Yeah,
but
I could spell it.
You could spell it. But
we
now,
could carve it into our stone tablets, yes.
And you'll right into the dirt.
Yeah.
Now you'll hear people use the term fairly commonly, and even conservatives will sometimes say, well, you know, economically I'm a libertarian, or people on the left will say, you know, socially I'm a libertarian. And so it's becoming part of the zeitgeist. And the reason that I really love that is because it breaks up this false dichotomy between the American left and the American right. I think that's really interesting. It provides a third way. In philosophy, we talk about a tertia via, a third way. You have all these false dichotomies. You're either this or you're that. And that's just not necessarily true. And so, for instance, does someone who supports free market also have to love war? Why? Why would someone be pro-war who's pro-free market? It doesn't really follow. And yet that's often assumed on the right. But the libertarian can say, no, I'm being consistent here. If markets are good at solving problems and states are bad at solving problems, then they're also bad in the area of military intervention.
Well, that's definitely something we want to get back to, because I've never understood I can understand people being opposed to war and interventionist foreign policy, but I have never seen heard a good argument as to why that's consistent with, say, libertarian principles.
Okay.
So that would be something we can we can talk about. Okay, and when we come back, we're going to talk about foreign policy and libertarianism, and we'll be back talking to Rachel Douchant of the Liberty Ethics Center. This is Free Exchange.
Can you help me with this? My new dad teaches me all kinds of stuff.
Sure.
He helps me with homework.
That would be 3.6795.
Thanks.
Yep.
He helps me with my decision making.
I wouldn't use this one. Ever.
And he's even teaching me how to drive.
And that's why cars have bumpers.
I'm learning so much.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Thousands of kids in foster care will take you just as you are.
Time to wake up.
I've got a job to do today.
I've got a job to do today.
Don't forget, you've got a job to do today.
Hey, Mom. I got the job. Thanks.
Got the job. Welcome aboard.
Have a good first day at work, Mom.
Your donations to Goodwill fund job training programs right in your community.
Feels good to start fresh, right?
Sure does.
And like that, you're a job creator.
What do you think it would be like to teach? Chances are, you have no idea. Teachers today are breaking down obstacles, finding innovative ways to instill old lessons, proving that greatness can be found in everyday places, and that you don't need to be famous to be unforgettable. That's what it's like to teach.
Hi, welcome back to Free Exchange. We're going to continue our discussion with Rachel Douchant from the Libertarian Ethics Center here at Lindenwood and talk a bit more about libertarianism and in particular libertarian foreign policy.
Yeah.
Because I've often thought that I haven't seen the link before, so if you could...
Right, it's not obvious necessarily how our emphasis on individual rights moves into the realm of foreign policy. So what I'm thinking is we might refer to, for instance, Immanuel Kant, who was a classical liberal. He's often pulled on for other things, but he was himself a classical liberal. And he had a beautiful ethical principle that he laid out that said that we ought to always treat persons as ends in themselves and never merely treat them just as a means to our ends. That's just using people. And it's part of respecting the dignity of human persons that we do that. So you can see that straightforwardly, for instance, in our form of government. You would have to have a Republican form of government because people need to be able to govern themselves. If I govern you, what justifies that? I'm just using you then, right? I'm ruling you in some way. Now, it would be different if you are participating in my government of you. Now I'm respecting your dignity. So that's how he's thinking about republicanism. And then when he starts talking about war, he applies that principle. Now, he's assuming that there is such a thing as a just war. So, for instance, if you go back to Thomas Aquinas and his requirements for just war, he has jus ad bello, which is justice to go to war, and jus in bello, justice in war. So in justice to go to war, he says, first of all, that I may not go to war with you unless you have done something wrong. In the paleoconservative tradition, we've assumed that wrongdoing would have to be actually attacking me. So I can attack you only because I'm really practicing self-defense. So that it's looking at the group just as we would look at two individuals. If you attack me, I can defend myself. No, of course you could consider maybe if you were attacking someone else, perhaps I could get involved as well, but then you'd have to understand kind of what my role is in that situation. So we can admit that there's justice in war. We still would want it to only be a last resort because it's such a serious undertaking. Try negotiating, try everything else, before you go to war because it's a very destructive force. And it also has to be fought by the proper authority. Has to sort of flow from the proper authority.
Now, you used the term before, pro-war, and I actually know very few people who are pro-war, even those who argue in favor of going to war at different times.
Sure.
Because, as you say, there are steps you can go through logically or make some judgments to say, okay, it's a last resort.
Right.
And then libertarians will still throw around this epithet at people that they're pro-war.
Yeah.
And I think it's absolutely incorrect. I mean, we see this with the Gulf War or the Iraq War.
Yeah.
I don't think that President Bush was pro-war. He decided to go to war. But to call him pro-war, I think is just ignorant, actually, because there were different steps went through, and he viewed it as a last resort. And you could say it was incorrect.
Right.
But that, it was that from the outset, he just liked the fact that he was going to war. I think that's, but people often accuse Bush in particular, but various decision makers of being pro-war.
Right. So Kant actually addresses this. He's got this very practical sort of set of articles at the beginning of Perpetual Peace where he talks about what it is to have a Republican form of government. And one of the points he makes, and this is shared with our founders, is that we don't want to have a standing army. And one of the reasons we didn't want to have a standing army is because, we hate to say it, but sort of if it's there, you'll use it. And that does tend to be how human nature kind of works. And so everyone's geared up and we've been training, and so if it's there, we'll use it. And I feel that we saw this exact same thing in Ferguson recently, right? Where we had a lot of very big fancy gear, and when something threatening happened, everybody put on their gear, and it really wasn't appropriate at all, but it was there, so we wanted to use it.
Well, say back in whatever century Kant was talking about, or decade, it must be
late
30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, late 1700s.
That might have been feasible.
Right,
but
technological
when
changes.
you have war where it's no longer that you have time to
Sure.
all you need to do is go and grab your spear and
Your
and
well-ordered
and
militias,
your shield
Howard.
and your well-ordered militia and run out.
Yeah.
Then that's fine, because your opponents are doing the same thing. They're marching over mountains to get to you, or taking a sea voyage of several weeks. But that's not where we are right now. And so a standing army is a necessity.
Right. So still, though, we want to sort of keep that principle in mind, that if we have something that we're constantly keeping up, that we sort of want to use it. Okay, so let's just hold that for a moment. And then he also talks about the danger of national debt. Because really, in ancient governments, people actually had to save up to go to war. They had to have a war chest, and then they didn't really want to spend it unless they really had to. And so you have a serious disincentive there. But with national debt, it makes it a lot easier, right? We can sort of shove off the costs onto the future. And so we're thinking there more about the thoroughgoing skepticism about government that libertarians tend to have. And what they're going to say is not that it's wrong. National defense is a legitimate use of government, because it's something that we're all invested in, and there may be a just cause to go to war, so we're admitting that. But the tendency of government, just due to its internal incentive system, is to overdo. It's to overproduce those public goods that it provides, and so we want to be always very on our guard whenever the government says, oh no, this is just, it really is, or oh no, we're really being attacked, like the Lusitania, cases like that, where you have a lot of sort of trumping up of reasons, and what exactly the motives are behind that can sometimes be confusing. It could be almost a machine that's going on its own.
What you're describing is not what modern libertarians say. Libertarians declare themselves to be anti-war, which is very different than being careful about when you go to war. Anti-war, declaring to be anti-war, means you're against war, and it's precluding the existence of the possibility of actually going to war for a good reason.
I think that's more rhetoric, because they're not pacifists. I mean, there are pacifists in the world, right? There's Mennonites and Amish and certain Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. But libertarians are not pacifists. As a matter of fact, they are very strong believers in self-defense. So I think when they use the term anti-war, it's rhetorical in the sense that we've been in a state of war almost constantly for a century now. And what we've seen are cases of entangling alliances where you have small scuffles turn into devastating world wars. And that's not exactly the description of what goes on later, but you see other forms of continuing, declaring police actions and things like that later in the century. So I think it's saying all this stuff we've been doing for the last century.
Well, it's also struck me that if we were Iceland, then the principles of libertarianism would be perfectly fine for foreign policy, but we're not.
Right.
Iceland can't do anything about genocide on the other side of the world.
Right.
The United States can.
Right.
So the United States saying we're going to do something or not do something has actual effects on maybe millions of people somewhere else in the world.
Yes.
And I think the notions that libertarians often have are more Icelandic than appropriate for the United States in the world today.
So I want to make a distinction between a sort of ideal principle and then applying that principle in a particular situation. So what the libertarian would often want to point out is how our interventionist policies or our entangling alliances got us into trouble in the first place. So for instance, even a lot of the genocide we see is the result of colonial decisions that were made a few hundred years ago, forcing people to be together in political systems.
Okay, so let's go to Uganda or whatever country it was in Africa, where the Hutus and the Tutsis.
Yes.
Okay. You could say, oh, it's Rwanda. So that's the result of genocide or of colonialism. They all killed.
And it absolutely
What
is.
on earth does that have to do with the United States today?
Right.
Because someone in the past was a colonial power, and because of that now there's genocide. We're supposed to say, well, someone in the past is responsible for that, doing something that might have some vague similarity to what we're talking about doing, so therefore we shouldn't do it. It seems irrelevant to me. So
not necessarily. So that's where I want to switch over from the ideal principle to the application in the particular case. So there may absolutely be applications of particular cases where we want to say that intervention would be morally justified. Now, how exactly we want to go about that may be a different question, but absolutely. So I'm not denying that. It's sort of the question, for instance, you can object to a war that America started, but if they created a situation that is now ongoing in another country, you can't just go, oh, we're done. And some libertarians do want to do that. They feel like that's better than what we're going to cause if we keep trying to intervene. But at least morally speaking, I understand your argument absolutely, that there may be an ethical imperative to intervene in a particular case. But what we see is actually a hugely unnecessary bureaucratic machine all over the world. I mean, just multiple military bases everywhere so that we're in a constant strategic position. And it's very costly. We have a military that is 4 times the size of China's military. If you put the next 15 world powers together, if you put their military budgets together, it equals ours. We could, blow up the world several times.
That argument is an argument that the U.S. Is very inefficient at spending money.
Yes.
It's not
That's right.
an argument for what we actually do with the military.
Yeah, so I think that I'm kind of trying to understand how this rhetorical sense in which libertarians call themselves anti-war, because you're absolutely right, they're not thoroughgoing pacifists. I think it really is more of a skepticism about everything we are actually doing, as opposed to a skepticism about the moral possibility that there can be a real reason to intervene at some point in a military situation. So for instance, should we have intervened to save Jews in World War II? Absolutely. But is it also the case that there would never have been a World War II if there hadn't been a World War I, which was caused by all of our entangling alliances? Yes. So we want to learn from the history instead of only celebrating ourselves for the good things that we did.
Well, I think it's a straw man. I don't think that's what people do when they decide to go, whether or not a country should go to war or not. They're not just celebrating. They're taking all of this into account. And I think the libertarian anti-war crowd, I don't know, they seem to throw around the epithet more often of people being pro-war rather than trying to understand and accept, well, maybe someone else has a different judgment. That's just what it strikes me over the last 10 or 15 years.
Well, I think maybe something that would be more compelling to you is if we compared the libertarian critique of our military processes to the libertarian critique of our economic processes, right? Where we see maybe legitimate issues like we've talked about before, externalities or public goods problems that need to be addressed, but we just really hate the way they're being addressed, right? And we don't think it's working and we don't think it's efficient and we think there's a lot of waste. So if we go back to Kant's principle, a lot of soldiers, for instance, are being used up in this situation in a way that could be entirely avoidable if we simply restructured our military to address problems as they actually exist.
Well, this is a fascinating topic, and maybe we'll come back to it at a different episode. This has been Free Exchange, and we've been talking to Rachel Douchant of the Liberty and Ethics Center here at Lindenwood University. And if you want to go to our website, use Google already, Hammond Institute, and you'll get to it. I don't need to tell you the website. Thanks.